After Moses, written by Michael F. Kane, narrated by Randy McCartan. Chapter 1. Europan Extraction. We always thought AI was going to be the death of us, rise up and take over everything. At least that's what the prophets of the day always claimed. Maybe they would have. But Moses came first. No one even knew where Moses came from. By the time we realized it was there, he was already in every network on the planet. He'd already absorbed all there was of human knowledge, read the Bible, and knew that God created the heavens and the earth. Also read Nietzsche and knew that man had killed God. He knew where we were headed. He saw the coming twilight of our civilization. That's why he picked his name, Moses, because he was going to lead us to a new promised land. Over the next century, he revolutionized technology, helped us colonize the solar system, put humans all the way out to the moons of Saturn. He promised that soon we'd spread amongst the stars. And then, one day, Moses was gone. A simple error message displayed on every terminal in the solar system. No one understood Moses in the first place, so no one understood what happened to him. Even worse, he couldn't support a new way of life. The economy collapsed overnight. Earth tore itself apart in wars. And the colonies? The colonies were left themselves to dwindle as the technology Moses gave them slowly failed. The dream of the stars died, but we lived on. Alexei Durakov, lithium prospector on Ganymede, died 64 a.m. A sleek and modern patrol craft drifted in a low orbit above Europa. Its sole occupant, a man in a black cowboy hat, glanced out the viewport at the white salt flats of the icy moon. Europa was a cold and deadly place, tamed only by failing technology and the cruelty of slavers. He thumbed through report after report on his monitor, its blue light flickering over his lavishly furnished office. The solid mahogany desk was a relic of a previous era that would have cost a fortune. He hadn't purchased it, of course, but had inherited it when its previous owner had met an untimely end. An end which had nothing to do with the desk, but everything to do with the man now sitting at it. Such was business. He had no intention of lingering for long at Europa. Most of his operations here had ended the better part of a decade ago. But it was important that he monitor the balance of power between the cartels. Necessary but utterly tedious work. His comm buzzed, promising something more captivating than the export prices of rice to the rest of Jupiter's moons. "This is Robert Ianson. With whom do I have the pleasure of speaking?" he said. This was not his real name, but it was one he had used for business of late.
"Vicente Luna,"
came the response. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added,
"Signor Ianson."
A man completely out of his element. This was either going to be entertaining or a complete waste of time. He looked back at the reports and closed them, folding his hands in front of him. "And what can I do for you, Mr. Luna? I'm not interested in social calls." The comm was quiet for a moment, before the other man continued.
I have heard it whispered that you're a man that makes things happen, difficult things.
He very much doubted that this man had business of the sort Robert Ianson took part in. That he had heard of him at all was a surprise. Still, no harm could come from a few minutes' diversion. "What is it that you hope I can do for you?" Mr. Luna hesitated again, more briefly this time.
I need passage to Mars.
The man took off his cowboy hat and set it beside him. "I think there is ample public transport you could hire."
I am a slave, and I have to be on Mars in a week. It's for my daughters.
"I don't need to know the specifics." Just as he'd suspected, this was going nowhere. "Mr. Luna, I'm impressed that you've heard my name, let alone figured out how to contact me. But this is rather outside the services I provide. A freelancer will suit you better." He almost disconnected the call, but decided against it as he realized that Mr. Luna had performed a small service for him. If a common slave had heard the name Robert Ianson, the usefulness of that particular name had drawn to an end. It was an unwitting service, but he would offer a bit of advice in return. "May I make a further recommendation, Mr. Luna?"
Yes, of course.
Desperate, as he should be. He had no idea how these sorts of transactions went. It would be a miracle if he actually made it to Mars. "Contact a freelancer or their broker directly. Otherwise, you will almost certainly be caught when you post to one of the public boards."
Oh, yes. That makes sense. Do you have a freelancer you would recommend?
The man pinched the bridge of his nose. He had humored this call far longer than he should have, and was only lengthening his time at the slaver's moon. A stray thought flitted through his mind. Maybe something would come of this conversation after all. He personally doubted that Cole would take a job on the moon after what had happened at Via Maria. But if he did... "Actually, Mr. Luna, I believe I do have a suggestion. Matthew Cole is a fine freelancer with experience operating on Europa. Let me give you his contact information." They finished their business quickly. Time was fleeting, after all. Mr. Luna was sounding much more optimistic by this point in the conversation.
What do I owe you for your services, Mr. Ianson?
He smiled to himself. "Cole is an old friend. You don't owe me a penny, but keep our conversation between ourselves. I'm doing a favor for him, you see, and he doesn't have to know that I was involved. Good day, Mr. Luna." He cut the call and made a note to check back in a week to see how this little incident turned out. It had been a long time since he'd thought about Matthew Cole. Perhaps it had been the wrong approach. Perhaps with a bit of coaxing, he could still be salvaged into something useful. His eyes fell on a wedge-shaped piece of polished metal at the corner of his desk, a quarter of a hole. He had an idea where another piece of the device was hidden, but the last two had long eluded him. It would take some convincing, but if Cole could be brought in on this little project, maybe, just maybe, that mystery would resolve itself. That, however, would have to wait for another day. The man cracked his knuckles and went back to his reports. The price of rice had risen by nearly 17% in the last quarter, and he needed to figure out exactly why that had happened. Matthew Cole closed the ramp of his ship, crossed the open field of grass, and walked up the dusty road into town. Overhead, Jupiter stood immobile in the sky, its bands of storms lit by the sun, making for an eerie twilight on the Europa. He pulled his poncho tighter to ward off the chill night air, or else maybe to ward off the darker thoughts that threatened to bubble up from his subconscious. It had been years since he'd been to Europa, but he wasn't planning on being here long, or running afoul of any of the cartels. Ahead of him, the town of San Martin glowed in the twilight. As far as he could tell from here, it was the usual frontier town you'd find all over Europa. A tired cluster of a few hundred buildings, huddled together, surrounded by several thousand square miles of farmland, before you reached the edge of the environmental shield. Matthew stopped and stood on his toes, bouncing up and down to feel his weight. Gravity was just short of standard. Either the grav plates were starting to fail, or the locals had turned it down for some reason. Good to know on the off chance you got into a fight. Never paid to dive for cover and overshoot your mark because you didn't realize you weighed less than usual. Not that he was expecting a fight. Passenger gigs were about the safest jobs a freelancer could take. Sometimes it was nice not to be shot at. You didn't make as much, but the reduced chance of death was definitely an up. The roads were nearly abandoned, though a few citizens scurried from place to place. As he approached the center of town, the rows of nearly identical concrete buildings gave way to slightly taller, nearly identical buildings. The only thing differentiating them was that once, long ago, they had all been painted in brilliant primary colors. Europa had been mostly colonized by South American immigrants back before Moses disappeared, and even leaving Earth, they'd not abandoned their culture like some colonies had. San Martin had been settled by Chileans, and a few tattered flags of their ancient homeland still flew on the faded buildings. That culture had been nearly drowned by the influx of slaves. Matthew reached the middle of town, a small public square with a few groomed trees, dominated by a Catholic church on one side, and the watering hole he was looking for on the other. The saloon had a single red neon sign that read Andres, that slowly flashed on and off, casting an obnoxious red glare over the otherwise peaceful plaza. He laid a hand on its outer door, with a backward glance at the church, before pushing it open and entering the building. If you've seen one backwater saloon, bar, or pub, you've seen them all. Dimly lit, dirty, and filled with local memorabilia. It was as close a thing to a home as any freelancer was likely to have. Seeing that the bar was mostly empty, Matthew took a seat on one of the stools. It was sometimes tricky to judge what schedules the locals used at any given settlement, since each particular rock had a different day-night cycle. But it was clearly the time when all good citizens of San Martin were asleep, which meant the few patrons were of the rougher sort. But they mostly lurked in booths, tending some drink of the stiff variety. The bartender, a large man with a small dark mustache, walked over to where Matthew sat on his stool. He raised an eyebrow expectantly, as if he couldn't be bothered to ask aloud what he would have to drink. "Cherry soda, please." He tipped his black Campero hat. The man stared at Matthew, and then laughed. "I failed to see what's funny," Matthew said casually. Sorry. I see a tough-looking out-of-towner roll into my saloon in the middle of the night. I expect him to order something a little harder than a cherry soda. That'll be $9. He slid the freshly poured drink towards Matthew. Matthew eyed it. "Seems a little steep. Town like this goes through a lot more whiskey than soda. Supply and demand. Simple economics, amigo." Matthew reached into his pocket and tossed a handful of coins across the counter. The bartender, whom Matthew assumed was Andre himself, looked at each of the coins closely, probably checking for counterfeits, before palming them. "So, if you don't mind me asking, you're some kind of teetotaler or something?" Matthew took a long drink from the sweet carbonated beverage and shrugged. Pays to be level-headed before a job. Freelancer, then. Well, I hope you're not about to shoot up my saloon. I'm more than prepared to defend my property. Andre didn't look up from what he was doing, as if to drive home the point that he was perfectly at ease handling such altercations. Hey, perk up, Andre. It's a lucky day for both of us. I'm just waiting on a passenger. Andre gave him a look to show him that he was irritated by Matthew's attempt at familiarity, and then gave him a curt nod and went back to his duties. Matthew sat for a few more minutes, sipping his soda in silence. If he was going to be ripped off, at least he was going to enjoy every last drop of the precious beverage. Sometime later, the door of the saloon pushed open, and a short, round man with a mullet walked in and sat in one of the booths. Even if he hadn't matched the physical description he'd been given, Matthew would have pegged the man as his client from the nervous way in which he fidgeted, which meant two things. This wasn't going to be a simple passenger job, and he was about to charge hazard rates. Matthew took the seat across from the man. Vicente Luna, I presume? Oh, si, Senor Cole. Thank you for taking my contract. Matthew nodded. You came looking for me. Speaking of, how did you come to hear of me? Oh, your reputation, of course. There was a bit of an untruth there, or maybe he wasn't telling the whole truth, but it probably didn't matter. How about you go ahead and explain just what it is you need? That nervous twitch you've got says there's more to the job than what you promised. Vicente's nose twitched and he licked his lips. It's just a passenger job, like I said. I need to be in Warszawa, Mars in 2 standard days. And I can do that. But that doesn't explain why you're shaking like a cornered animal. Oh, it's complicated. Vicente leaned forward and cautiously pulled up the sleeves of his shirt. On his arm was a titanium tracking bracelet with a single green light that flashed on and off. Matthew sat back in his seat and took off his campero, setting it on the table in front of him. Which cartel owns you? Whose territory are we in? He asked, eyes narrowed. Slavery was ubiquitous on Europa. Its warm subterranean oceans gave a ready supply of irrigation water and made it the perfect agricultural center for the Jupiter neighborhood. Long ago, the fields, protected by environmental shields, had been tended by robotics, but that had been in Moses' time. Now, as the robotics failed, with no way to replace them, a booming slave market, led by a handful of cartels, had taken hold on the moon. Does it matter who owns me? I've already got the payment forwarded to your broker and can get however much you could possibly ask when we get to Warszawa. Yes, it does matter. Matthew pointed an accusing finger at Vicente. He felt his blood pressure rising. Why had he even come to Europa to begin with? The odds of him running up against a cartel were all but guaranteed. I'd put an end to every filthy slaver in the solar system if I could, but I can't. I'm just one man. And if I free a slave, I make an enemy. I need to know who that enemy is before I decide if it's worth it or not. He folded his hands on the table. And you'd better not tell me it's Hueso Rojo. Vicente smiled. It's Hueso Rojo. Then we're through here. Matthew stood to leave, but was stopped as Vicente desperately grabbed his arm. Wait, please, senor, just hear me out. Against his better judgment, Matthew sat. You've got 1 minute to talk me into it. With a stab of guilt, he knew that he meant it. He didn't like the idea of leaving the poor man to his fate, but he had to watch out for his own skin, too. Relief flooded Vicente's face. Look, it's not for me, not really. My daughter Emilia, I smuggled her off of Europa years ago, and she's made a nice life for herself on Mars. Last week, I got a message from her. She's marrying a Polish boy. Comes from a good family, wealthy. She'll be happy and safe, and I need to see my girl again. He started crying, soft tears running down his face. You can even bring me back and turn me into the cartel afterwards. I don't care, as long as I can see her get married." He trailed off and slumped into the booth. After a story like that, there was really only one way this was going to turn out. Matthew knew what he was going to do, despite his misgivings, and he didn't like it. While he certainly didn't mind hurting Hueso Rojo, it was going to make it more difficult for him to operate around Jupiter. Any job he took out here was going to be more dangerous and that much more likely to get him killed. But the sight of the sad little man in front of him was more than he could bear. Fine, but it's gonna cost triple. He was, after all, still a businessman. Vicente's tears dried at once. He smiled brightly. "Oh, senor, thank you. My daughter's new family can pay you handsomely." "Are you ready to go? Do you need anything else?" "Only the clothes on my back." Matthew pointed at the tracker beneath his sleeve. "When is that thing gonna alert your owners that you're on the run?" "I'm a mechanic at one of their garages a few blocks from here. If I get close to the edge of the city, it'll probably go off." "I'm parked outside of San Martin," Matthew said, scratching the stubble on his chin. "Which means we're basically guaranteed trouble. Okay then, here's what we're gonna do." Half a block ahead of Matthew, Vicente walked down the sidewalk, hands shoved in his pockets and sticking out as badly as he could. He kept glancing around nervously, sometimes even looking backward over his shoulder. Poor man was terrified. Matthew muttered under his breath. He should have coached Vicente a little more on how not to look so glaringly like a runaway slave. But he suspected it wouldn't have done much good. The man wasn't used to subterfuge or deception, and never would be. They were useless skills for the life he'd lived as a mechanic. Subtlety was something that had never been asked of him before, and if he made it to Mars, wouldn't be asked of him again. Problem was, Matthew was stuck with him in the meantime. If they'd had more time, Matthew could have returned to his ship and retrieved his grav bike, and they could have just ridden out of town before anyone could react. But Vicente had insisted that he had been out too long after slave curfew, which meant there wasn't much of a plan. Keep on marching till the slave bracelet started screaming, and then play it from there. They were only a couple of blocks from the edge of town. Matthew felt a vain hope that maybe it wouldn't go off. Maybe they'd march right out to the Sparrow and leave this forsaken rock. He'd known it was a bad idea coming here, but the promise of an easy job had been too good to pass up. A shriek sounded from down the street. Vicente had stopped and was staring at his wrist. Even from here, Matthew could see the red light. "Move it," he muttered to himself. Almost as if he'd heard him, the mechanic suddenly straightened and started to run down the street. "Much better," Matthew said, and flew into action. He dove into an alleyway at a sprint, adjusting his gait to compensate for the slightly lower gravity. It wasn't low enough to really impair his movement, just enough to be annoying. He heard a rumble behind him and managed to turn just in time to see a six-wheeled troop transport roar down the road toward Vicente. That didn't take long. Better keep moving. His alleyway cut all the way through to the next street, and he continued running, cutting around the block to get up in front of Vicente. By the time he had circled around to the far side and emerged behind them, Vicente was already on the ground, cuffed. 4 men stood over him. One of the 4 slavers kicked him in the side for sport, and Matthew felt his blood boil. He knew this sort all too well. Slowing to a walk, he drew his revolver, aimed, and put a bullet in 2 of them before they even knew they were in danger. The other 2 reacted at once, jumping behind the troop carrier for cover. Matthew kept advancing, aware that he had minimal cover of his own on the street, but the closer he got, the more advantage his revolver would have over their rifles. When he was a little over 30 feet from the carrier, one of the men popped around the side to try to get a quick shot at him. Fortunately, Matthew was faster and put a bullet into the man's arm for his efforts. The gun clattered to the ground, but its bearer managed to retreat to safety. The leader used the distraction to break cover on the other side of the carrier and fire a shot at Matthew. It was close. Matthew heard the crack of the bullet's sonic boom as it split the air by his ear. He returned 3 shots, missing with the first and connecting with the next 2. His enemy toppled to the ground, unmoving. He advanced, knowing that the one injured enemy remained a threat. He rounded the troop carrier just as the last wounded thug reached for his lost weapon. Matthew put the 7th and final round of his revolver into the man's hand. He cried out in pain and slumped to the ground in defeat. "Get up, Vicente. We've got to go." The little man stood up and stared in awe at the bodies. Matthew had already secured the key to the handcuffs and freed Vicente. "See." He stood unmoving, as if in shock. "Vicente, if you want to see your daughter, get those feet moving, now." The mechanic snapped out of it and, turning away from the bodies, started walking towards Matthew's ship. Matthew glanced quickly inside the carrier and saw it had a thumbprint key. He briefly considered dragging the body of the leader over to see if he could start the vehicle, but knew that would burn precious time that they didn't have. He jogged to catch up to Vicente as they left San Martin behind and crossed the empty field. The ruddy light of Jupiter over their shoulder cast long shadows on the grass before them. Matthew could only hope they would make it to the ship before cartel reinforcements came, and that they wouldn't identify him. That was the last thing he needed. There was already enough bad blood between Matthew Cole and Hueso Rojo. They were only 100 feet from the ship when the bright lights of a vehicle fell on them from behind. With no cover in the open field, they didn't stand a chance. "Run!" Matthew shouted as they crossed the final distance to the ship. He remotely lowered the ramp just as the bullets began to thwack the ground around them. Fired from a moving vehicle, they were wild and poorly aimed. But even a poorly aimed gun can be lethal if you're unlucky. He dashed into the ship, and Matthew mashed the button to close the ramp. "Welcome to the Sparrow." Running to the cockpit, he jumped into the pilot's chair and punched the ignition button. It wasn't likely that small arms would damage the Sparrow's outer hull, but it never hurt to be careful. Plus, odds were the cartel had a friend or two in orbit that they were already contacting. The Sparrow roared to life, and Matthew felt gravity return to standard as the grav plates beneath their feet fired up. Vicente stumbled into the cockpit. "Strap in," Matthew said, gesturing to the co-pilot's chair. "Unless you know how to operate a thumper turret." Vicente's eyes went wide, an expression that Matthew took to be a resounding no. He'd just have to outmaneuver any enemies, or use the nose guns. Hopefully they wouldn't get that close. He fired the landing thrusters and lifted off the ground before lighting up the main engines. The Sparrow rumbled as they picked up speed. Matthew heard a few stray bullets glance off the hull on his side. He'd have to check each and every one later for damage. In the meantime, his console gave no warning lights, so he'd just have to go on in good faith. They quickly left San Martin behind, and Matthew rolled the Sparrow to put Europa above them. He had a suspicion that Vicente had never left the moon he'd been born on. May as well let him see it from above. The farmland surrounding San Martin rushed by, and there was a slight jolt as they passed out of its environmental shields. They were beyond the furthest reaches of the settlement now, as they roared over the yellow-white of Europa's salt and ice flats. Matthew pulled the throttle back, and the Sparrow gained altitude and speed, now free atmospheric drag and burning for the freedom of space. He glanced at the scopes. A few ships were here and there in local orbit, but none looked like they were moving to intercept yet. No sooner had the thought passed through his head than 2 blips began adjusting their orbit. They'd make it before he reached the altitude he needed for a clean frame shift. "Hey, tell you what, Vicente, I think you get to try and wing it on the thumper turret." "I don't know what—" "It's fine. Even if you just scare him a bit, give us some time. You got a few minutes. Follow the main hall through the common room to the aft hall. Open the door at the end, sit in the chair. I'll turn on the intercom and talk you through it." Vicente did as he was told, and Matthew spent the next few minutes between watching the Sparrow's instruments as he guided them into orbit and explaining the thumper to Vicente. It was easy enough a child could do it, probably, though Matthew admitted he hadn't actually taught a child. The thumper itself was a neat piece of tech that worked on the same principles as the grav plates. All of it was artificial space-time curvatures, the fanciest bit of magic that Moses ever worked. Thumpers sent a bubble of extreme curvature at high velocity towards its target. Getting hit with a gravity gradient that big would do massive damage as it ripped apart ships, bodies, and anything else that got in the way. The nose gun was unfortunately only a 30mm chain gun, not so useful in space, where the distance of 100 miles could be considered too close for comfort. All right, they're coming into range, Vicente. I'm going to start weaving. I don't know what kind of weaponry they've got, so I don't want to present an easy target.
Just tell me when to try and shoot.
Vicente's voice came back over the intercom. Matthew looked at the readouts again. They definitely weren't going to reach a high enough altitude to frame shift before the cartel blips closed the gap into firing range. He tapped his fingers on the console impatiently, willing the engines to go just a little faster. When hostile thumper blasts started peppering the space around the Sparrow, he knew they were out of time. "Now's good, Vicente." Matthew watched the aft cam. Vicente certainly wasn't going to be a professional anytime soon, but the cartel ships did begin to dart and weave, which slowed the rate at which their orbit would intersect the Sparrows. "Keep it up. You've got 'em dancing. A hit would be nice, but we'll take what we can get." The mechanic squeaked a response as he continued trying to get shots at the distant enemies. Matthew tried not to imagine what would happen if one of those thumper blasts hit the Sparrow. If they were lucky, it would just rip holes in the hull that could be sealed off with bulkheads. If they were unlucky, they'd be a shooting star for all of Europa to see. Suddenly, a light on the console turned red. "Hey, Vicente, we've got a new problem."
Oh, Dios, no. What now? I thought we already had problems.
"We do, but this one is new and bad. You see that little red mark on your display?"
Yes. What is it? Make it go away.
"Actually, you're going to be the one to do that. It's a torpedo." Vicente didn't answer, so Matthew kept talking. "If we're lucky, it's an EMP torpedo and it fries our systems. Looks like we're going fast enough to stay in orbit if it hits, so that's a plus. Of course, when they board us, they'll kill us both, probably after a nasty fight. If we're not lucky, it's just a high-explosive torpedo. I think you know what happens if that's the case." Vicente was still silent. "It's all you now, Vicente. If we're going to make it through, it's going to be because you make the shot." As an afterthought, he added, "Think of your daughter and how glad she'll be when we roll into Varsava." Vicente still didn't answer, and Matthew wondered if he'd gone into shock. "Figures," he thought to himself. "I'd take a job I know I shouldn't because it's the right thing to do, and here I am, about to get spaced." He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, took off his Campero and tossed it aside. Maybe he could leave the cockpit unattended and run back to the turret just long enough to. The aft thumper started firing, and Matthew's heart stopped beating. Precisely spaced shots. Matthew watched the rear cam as Vicente slowly dialed in the shot, each one getting a bit closer to the target as the torpedo homed in on them. It had already closed over half the distance and was shaving off the remaining miles by the second. Why did the thing have to be so fast? Matthew took a chance and straightened his flight path to give Vicente a cleaner shot, praying that a thumper wouldn't connect in the meantime. 10 miles to impact. He held his breath. At just over 1 mile distance, the torpedo blossomed into a brilliant fireball that was quickly snuffed by the vacuum of space.
Alabanza Dios!
Vicente shouted over the intercom, and Matthew let out a breath and slumped into his chair. The torpedo's debris wave slammed into the Sparrow's aft environmental shield, and several pieces of shrapnel rang off the hull. Matthew glanced at his boards but didn't see any warning lights showing system damage. The cartel ships continued to fire thumper blasts their way, but in another 20 seconds they'd be far enough from Europa's gravity well to frame shift. He started charging the capacitors that powered the device. When the clock hit 0, he punched it. There was a brief moment of disorientation as the frameshift worked its magic, instantly transitioning them from a few thousand miles per hour to nearly 2% the speed of light. He let the device run for almost 30 seconds before disengaging it with a similarly disorienting jolt. "You did good, Vicente. We're away." Matthew ran a hand through his messy hair and put his hat back on. That was a lot closer than he'd bargained on. As Vicente rejoined him in the cockpit, Matthew spun the Sparrow around to let the man see the only home he'd ever known. Jupiter floated majestically in the blackness of space, truly the king that the ancients had imagined it to be. Its moons lay scattered in orbit around their master, glowing orbs of light in the dark. "The close one is Europa," Matthew said in explanation, then turned to the computer to plot a course to Mars. Thankfully, Mars and Jupiter were reasonably near one another right now. They'd make it to the wedding with time to spare. He stole a glance back at Vicente, who had tears on his cheeks and appeared to be praying. Matthew felt a pang of envy and concentrated on the job he still had to do. Two days later, Matthew stood on a small hill outside of Warszawa, Mars. In the distance, dull red bluffs rose above the horizon, and a late afternoon sun turned the sky to floral pink. Here, beneath the environmental shield, green grass carpeted the land. A century-old oak tree watched over the hill, probably planted by the first colonists, and it was against this ancient century that Matthew stood. Down the hill, a wedding reception was in full swing, a garish mix of Polish and Chilean culture. A moment of happiness in a solar system slowly dying. Vicente's daughter looked just as he had imagined her, beautiful and dark-haired, like her mother apparently. Vicente had spent most of the flight to Mars chattering away about his family, wondering aloud at the life his daughter had lived in her absence. Matthew didn't mind so much. He'd just gone about his work, catching up on the never-ending cycle of routine maintenance. It was something he never quite got ahead of. He was paid on landing and had thought that was the end of it, until Vicente had all but demanded he attend the wedding. It was the first time Matthew had been in a church in a decade, but he couldn't quite shake the feeling that someone might recognize him. He knew that was a foolish thought. After all, Mars was a long way from Villa Maria. Maybe it was just paranoia that the Hueso Rojo ships had ID'd him. But then there was no way they could know who was flying the Sparrow. That said, they would certainly know the Sparrow now. Maybe he'd avoid Europa entirely for a few months, or forever. Matthew reached into his poncho to pat his breast pocket, feeling the hefty weight of the $1,000 coins. He turned and walked away from the wedding reception to where he'd parked the Sparrow down the hill. Sometimes it felt good doing the right thing, but then it also felt good to get paid.
Thank you for listening to the first chapter of After Moses. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell right there. That will make sure that you get a notification for when Chapter 2 releases in a few weeks. Also, consider liking the video and leaving a comment beneath. YouTube's algorithms value that form of engagement more than any other, and that helps me out. And finally, if you'd like to support me, consider purchasing a copy of the book. There's 4 books released in the series so far, of which this is just the very first chapter, the very beginning. Links beneath are to Amazon, where you can get a hold of either ebook or paperback. I'd like to give a big thank you to Randy McCartan. He's the narrator. I've got links beneath in the description to both his Fiverr profile and his website, so if you've got a project, I'm sure he would love to have your business. And lastly, I'd like to give a thank you to Karel. He composed the little musical opener and the interludes and the closer. And I've also got links beneath to where you can contact him. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you stick around for Chapter 2 and beyond.